For better or worse, anime characters are their voices. However, that's just one of various elements that make them up, alongside their overall design, associated musical motifs, how they're animated, and so on. The reason fans forge connections with these characters, positive or negative, is due to that sense of identity that emerges when all these facets combine into a whole that is unmistakably that character. It sounds like common sense, but as you can imagine, if just one of those integral aspects of identity was treated as fundamentally interchangeable, that might not sit too well with a lot of people. Nowadays, viewers can swap out the characters' voices and language at the touch of a button. However, it wasn't always that easy.
We need balls!
What the Earth needs is not a gentle guardian, but a warrior.
Who's in?
Walking voiceover encyclopedia Chris Niosi has a series called Did You Know Voice Acting on his channel, with Dragon Ball being the show with the most episodes dedicated to it by far, which is no surprise given the franchise's rather complicated history on Western television. But of course, this wasn't the only way to get exposed to the series back then. While the Japanese dub aired on the international channel without subtitles, bootleg fansub tapes were also in circulation at the time, regardless of the quality of some of those subtitles. This wasn't just a case of fans discovering the Japanese version and thinking it was better, this was just proof that the story existed beyond what was on television at any given time. However, with the internet being what it was back then, the original audio's reach in America was dwarfed by the exposure Dragon Ball Z would get on Toonami in English. For a lot of TV viewers, there was little source of comparison, nor drive to seek the original language track out until the online world became more accessible years later, along with subsequent DVD releases which had both language tracks available to listen to. But even then, comparison wasn't at the forefront of most fans' minds. In 2015, when Dragon Ball Super began airing on Japanese television, the sheer difference between the US and Japanese dubs was brought back into the wider community's collective consciousness, as fans of the old Funimation dub were now forced to make comparisons. The choice was either A, watch along with a completely different language track and cast than they were used to, or B, wait an unknown amount of time for the dub to come out, as Funimation still had not made an announcement. Naturally, there were complaints regarding the Japanese version, but the nature of some of them had more to do with the fact that the voices in each dub sounded almost nothing alike, rather than the Japanese one being quote-unquote bad. And if there was ever one character that summed up the discussion behind these fan comparisons, it would undoubtedly be... Certain fans have become infamous for dismissing the performance of Son Goku's original Seiyu, Masako Nozawa, primarily on the grounds that she sounds nothing like the muscle-bound man she plays, with some even giving her the derogatory nickname, Grandma Goku. I will fully admit that I was also one of these very people just a few years ago, because for the first time in my life, I went from having a character that spoke like this,
Allied to good! Nightmare to you!
to suddenly being stuck with them sounding like this. It's very much an observation most often informed through the lens of the English-speaking voice actors that so many Western fans were exposed to first. Most of these versions of the characters have played up the angle of the righteous or masculine hero who always stood up for others and protected the weak. However, since Nozawa has been voicing the character since he was a boy, she more effectively retains the childish energy and immaturity through her vocal register and mannerisms, no matter how old the character got. Both have their advantages and disadvantages, sure, but at the end of the day, they still speak to the core traits that make Goku the prominent character that he is. The discussion regarding differing dramatic and cultural sensibilities between regions and languages is something beyond the scope of this video. Some Western fans who aren't as acquainted with Japanese voiceover might dismiss it outright due to their general unfamiliarity. Personally, when I started watching anime subbed, I felt like I had no way to discern what I did and didn't like in the voice acting itself. However, nowadays, I can say that I'm a fan of certain seiyuu and follow their work specifically. As we mentioned before, viewers can come to interpret one or several aspects of a performance to be part and parcel to the experience. Pitch, cadence, mannerisms, overall direction, vocabulary, syntax, interactions. All these elements combine with the context of the show to create the character everyone gets familiar with. After all, since voice acting can be a means of portraying a mindset instead of just a sound, the last thing some people want is a different brain in the body of a character they already know.
Well, I would definitely describe this as bad.
Are you kidding? That sounds fantastic!
So if the Japanese or English audio sounds like it has even one of those elements missing, or not maintained a certain way, then some fans will consider it a failure regardless of autonomous merits or even faults it could possibly possess. Perhaps people can be too quick to make judgments on an alternate language performance for a character without really giving it a chance to breathe. Even I'm not exempt from that closed-mindedness, as some of my previous videos reflect this. As mentioned before, fansubs were in circulation in the West through tapes, even when television was one of the biggest sources of mainstream exposure anime had. However, getting a hold of those subbed episodes was arguably much more of a commitment than it is today, meaning that anime on TV was still a more accessible option for general audiences. But as time went on, things began to shift thanks in part to the internet. For example, when I was in middle school, I watched Naruto week to week on television. But once I discovered edgy Linkin Park AMVs that used footage which hadn't yet aired on Cartoon Network, I eventually figured out that more of the show was available on developing platforms like YouTube. To an impatient kid in the early 2000s like me, watching content chopped up in parts with subtitles in 240p was a small price to pay considering the amount of story that was now accessible. But nowadays, with the ever-prominent exposure of legal simulcast services where fans can watch the subbed version the same day it airs in Japan in high definition, this feels like less of a compromise and more like the more practical and convenient option. Because of this, there's more opportunity for fans to see the original Japanese version of shows first, leading to their view of what the dialogue should sound like being put through the lens of the Japanese version more often than not, unlike the aforementioned shows where the opposite might occur more frequently.
With Super, we see a huge amount of fans who originally would not, for the life of them, watch the Japanese version of Dragon Ball, be like, fine, I guess I've got to listen to an old woman play Goku. And the next thing they're like, no, this shit's great. I like watching this version. And I'm like, you just have to give it a chance.
I've been watching the Japanese probably since Super started. And now, like, when I go on Toonami and watch the English dub, I'm just like, this feels foreign.
The observation Kieran made when the Universe 6 dub stuff started happening. And now he's like, this is the first time Dragon Ball fans have ever had to deal with, no, this isn't how this character should sound when a dub comes out.
It makes sense that convenience would be one deciding factor when it comes down to which did you see first, because us humans are inherently impatient. We'll try to satiate our desires as readily as possible, and that's especially true in the current landscape of watching the quote original and staying plugged into what's going on. Understandably, fans want to be informed, up to date, and ensured that they receive things straight from the horse's mouth, regardless if that horse needs subtitles. I love how far the community has come from the old days of syndicated television and expensive VHS tapes, but there is a part of me that's a little bit concerned, because that desire for preserving the original can potentially lead to tunnel vision. To me, it feels like dubs nowadays are being perceived by a large audience as just add-ons, which is honestly quite easy to do given that the Japanese audio usually premieres further ahead. Producing a new audio track is usually much more expensive, time-consuming, and resource-intensive than creating subtitles for an already voiced product. Seeing something first, whether it's dubbed on Adult Swim in the 2000s, subbed on Crunchyroll in the 2010s, or any other way, can allow it to set its own terms. And it's the lack of awareness that can create a more holistic experience for the viewer, rather than rewatching what is supposedly the same product. For instance, when it comes to the English dub of a silent voice, on the one hand there are the observations that some aspects of voiceover weren't very similar in this particular product. The depth of Shoya's voice, Nagatsuka's way of telling jokes, the overall styles of projection feeling different in both versions, and so on. On the surface, these can be seen as inherently negative because of how they deviate from what's heard in the original, but doing so in that manner would be writing off how they could tie into the deeper essence of the film as a whole. Some conceits arguably were made weaker by the change in language through adaptation, but a big source of praise for the dub was that the female lead, Shoko, was played by Lexi Cowden Marmon, a deaf-accented actress who gave the story a layer of nuance that her Japanese counterpart fundamentally could not do.
Can we be friends?
However, there was a distinct backlash against her being cast, particularly in the comments section of the trailer that revealed her voice, criticizing her for either not sounding deaf enough or not sounding as cute as the Japanese version. Ordinarily, this is just a cliche of these dub trailers and the knee-jerk reactions people often have, but I believe this scenario is a bit different in a rather disturbing manner. As somebody who has experience working with special needs children, I know that not every single hearing impairment is exactly identical, so the idea that one performance can sound quote-unquote more deaf than the other is honestly insulting, especially when considering that people are judging the authenticity of an actual deaf accent by the standards of a non-authentic one. This is definitely an extreme, and personally I think both performances work exceptionally well from a dramatic standpoint, but it's astounding how far this bias can go for people on a personal level to the point where it can even override context. We see people write off dubs a lot because they're not as, quote, believable as the original. But how much of that sense of believability is rooted in genuine critique, and how much of it is just a rejection of the unfamiliar?
Drowning in the introspection he couldn't even spell, he grasped at answers. And then, as it all went black, he found one.
Who cares, baby?
Disclaimer, of course people aren't immune to changing their minds over time, and there are plenty of dubs that will put people off regardless of whether or not they saw it first, which of course goes both ways. We've even quoted Brian Rue in a previous editorial where he mentions he preferred the subbed version of Ghost in the Shell despite having watched the dub first.
You don't even know your own name, you stupid dickhead.
Heck, I remember when fans were saying that the dub of Black Clover would be superior to the Japanese version before it even came out, solely on the back of Asta's Saiyan.
Your voice annoys me.
We're not saying people shouldn't compare the ins and outs of multiple interpretations. If anything, we encourage it above all else. But when this unfamiliarity alone is used as a claim to low quality and avoiding the critical discussion that should come with talking about voiceover, it's hard not to be a little bit disheartened when it happens as frequently as I'm afraid it does. Again, this video has been discussing a limited kind of scenario. However, it's one that doesn't just apply to English versus Japanese debates, but in all the different language versions created by dozens of different teams all over the world. Every version has their own slightly different adaptation of the show at hand, each being dismissed by different audiences who weren't aware of that version as their first gateway into a show, and a never-ending butting of heads with other people's preferences, regardless of quality. Or alternate language versions being vehemently defended by nostalgia-goggled fans, again, regardless of quality. We'd like to think that the real answer lies somewhere in the middle of these extremes. As far as anime goes, we've already reached a point where we can't go backwards. Shows don't need dubs to get widely popular in non-Japanese speaking communities, and hardcore fans are always going to want to stay up to date with what their favorite Japanese creators wanted. Most of this is all connected to that shift in how we appreciate media based on what's more convenient to us at the time. And maybe nowadays, the conversation has shifted altogether from which did you see first to what came first. But what happens when convenience is no longer a prominent factor? In theory, an ideal scenario for fans would be one where both conveniences exist, not only where titles are broadcast overseas as soon as possible, but where people are able to choose between the two in real time and embrace their choice, or, if they have the time, appreciate both. Certain initiatives have emerged in recent years that seem to lead towards this scenario. Funimation simuldubs, HIDIVE's dubcast, and even Netflix's ability to release episodes with multiple language dubs and subtitles at once. We've discussed the circumstances that can affect certain simulcast releases in prior videos. However, as of writing this, the overall impact these services might have is something that's currently still in motion. In any case, it could benefit people who can't consume subtitled media, such as those with sight-based or reading disabilities, or just younger viewers who can't keep up with or understand subtitled versions, so that they too can join the discussion as it unfolds. Just because we can't go backwards in some regards, doesn't mean we can't move forward in others. Think back to Dragon Ball's journey to the Western anime market. How long it took, the failed attempts, the changing cast, the extensive re-editing, the fact that you had to find expensive bootleg tapes to watch the Japanese version till DVDs became common, and now think of My Hero Academia, airing this very season. For the first several weeks, you can choose between the subbed or dubbed version of the episode, and the current standard for the adaptation process means that switching between the two will be nowhere near as jarring as DBZ. Currently, examples like this are still far from the majority. It might be too optimistic to think that dubs will be less stigmatized in the current environment if they somehow manage to come out at the same time as the Japanese version all the time. Much like the anime themselves, dubs are products, and bad products will always be created or offered alongside the good ones. However, the overall reputation against foreign anime dubs, in some cases, can make it difficult to discern what parts of a dub truly deserve the bad reception, from the parts that get dismissed simply for what they are. But at the very least, we think this is a conversation worth having regarding the relevance of dubbed anime itself, not just if it's good or bad. Whether a dub is faithful to a fault, completely misses the mark, or strikes just the right balance for you, it's going to be different from the original. Despite what some comments say or the dumb jokes I make on Twitter might imply, we here at the Cartoon Cypher believe that the bigger priority is the option to watch both language versions of a given show when available. And although preferences or the need to make comparisons are inevitable, they're also important. It's how people make sense of everything going on for themselves. But it's what they end up doing with those comparisons that really matter in the end. This video is made more to promote discussion rather than simply inform. A more biased approach, certainly, but one we think is important when it comes to adding more to the ongoing conversation. I look forward to reading your thoughts on the subject in the comments down below, and until next time.